If you give us writing, won't we forget how to remember things? If you give us calculators, won't we forget how to do maths? If you give us printing, will we forget how to write things? Every time we come up with some new innovation like this, it freaks people out.
Greetings, Grammarpaloozians. I am here today with Keith Houston. If you're listening to the main episode, we talked all about his new book, Faced with Tears of Joy, about emoji. But he has this other great book called The Book that is all about the technology of the physical form of the book. And I thought it would be so interesting to talk to him about that in our bonus segment today. Thank you so much for supporting the show. We really appreciate you. Keith Houston is the author of another book also called Shady Characters, and he runs the Shady Characters blog, which is about interesting punctuation marks. So he's always doing interesting things. Keith Houston, welcome to the Grammar Girl podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the book, wow, a book about the book. That is so cool. And it talks about the technology of the book. And so we have Papyrus, we have Parchment, and we have paper. So, do you consider Papyrus to be sort of the first book technology?
I think so. I think that's a reasonable way to go about it. It's funny. When we talked about emoji, we talked about how it's really difficult to nail down what an emoji is, and when the first emoji came along. It's kind of the same with books. So I started out with the idea. I guess I worked backwards from the idea of a physical book, sort of like this one, the new paperback edition of the book. And I wanted to see where that came from, and so we think about books as being mostly made of paper, I guess. And then there was a time where they were mostly made of parchment. And before that, there was a time when they were mostly made of papyrus. And in fact, before that, I guess you get back into cuneiform and clay tablets and so on. So people were writing long works, but they weren't perhaps portable. I think there was something about, what is the definition of a book? And I guess I had in my head it's something which is portable and self-contained. And I feel like a very large book made out of clay tablets is perhaps not quite the same thing.
Mm-hmm. You don't want 20,000 words on a clay tablet.
No, indeed. In fact, there was one particular time or period in history that I was looking at, which was when China. So paper was invented in China, probably in the 2nd century BCE or thereabouts. And before that, books were written on either silk, which was very expensive but very light, or on bamboo slips, they're called. So take a long piece of bamboo and split it into kind of thin strips, which works well for Chinese writing, which is typically top to bottom, right to left, and you'd string these strips together to make a kind of a thing you could roll up. But this was also heavy, and it turns out that Chinese emperors were sometimes, or scholars in fact, were sometimes talked about in terms of the weight of their knowledge. How many cartloads of books have you read, or how many cartloads of documents have you signed today? So the physical weight of these things was significant and important, and it meant something. And of course, I guess we have books. They're not small, they're not light, but they're a lot lighter than if this was made of bamboo or clay.
Yeah. Last time I moved, it was my husband said I had too many books. I completely obviously disagree. But yeah, imagine moving if you had to move like the bamboo scrolls, if they're so much heavier.
Oh, indeed. Yeah. I mean, yeah, literal carts to move libraries around. Yeah.
Wow. So, so the story about paper being invented in China was actually one of the interesting things in the book. I was surprised how many different materials can be used to make paper.
It ends up being pretty much any sort of fiber, any sort of fibrous plant. So I think the canonical ones at the start were, I think it's largely hemp. So things like old fishing nets, which had been made out of hemp rope, made out of hemp rope, but also the bark of the mulberry tree or mulberry bush. There's a particular species of mulberry which is called the paper mulberry, and it has this very thin, I think it's called white bast, between the outer bark and the wood itself. And these two things, these were the main ingredients of the very first paper, which is said to have been made by this eunuch at the Chinese court called Cai Lun. He probably didn't make it. Someone else did. Someone else probably invented it a couple of hundred years before he lived, but he got credit for it. And it was said that he went to a pool in his back garden and soaked all of these materials, this hemp and I think old clothes and the bark of the mulberry tree, into this kind of soup, almost this sort of white silky soup, and then used a
Mhm.
mold, perhaps made of bamboo, dipped into this pool, drew it out, and let it dry. And that was the invention of paper, allegedly, and that was basically how people made paper for quite a long time afterwards.
Yeah, you made paper for the book. What was that like?
It was fantastic. It's such a
Yeah.
it's I'm a software engineer by trade, and so a lot of the stuff that I do just exists in an incredibly ephemeral way. It's all just electrons. It's all just magnetic charges. Um, and to do something which seems, well, books did not seem anachronistic to me when I was writing this, sort of 10 years ago or so. Um, but paper making weirdly felt like I never really thought about the process. It's where does paper come from? How is it made? So I went to see an artist in Edinburgh, in Scotland, who makes her own paper, and she let me try it out. She had a machine called a Hollander beater, which is a kind of metal tank that just chewed up fiber and made it into this, as I said, this kind of this soup. I took a mold, I dipped it in, I drew it out, and I was doing the same thing that Sai Lun and his lackeys had done 2,000 years ago, and it worked. It made this paper which was really kind of rough and tough. It's hard to imagine writing on it with, say, a fountain pen, but of course in China they used brushes and still do for sort of traditional calligraphy, so it didn't matter quite as much. And so just that one experience, I think, taught me quite a lot about the variability of paper. And I also then actually went to a paper mill, an industrial paper mill, again in Scotland, quite near where I grew up. Um, and that was an entirely different experience. It's this giant. It's exactly a factory as you imagine it being. It has giant machines. It has smells. It's warm. There's steam. There's lots of noise. Everyone's wearing high vis vests and hard hats. Um, and the paper you get out of that is entirely different. It's white and pristine and perfect for a printed book, like these ones. So there's
Mhm.
such a gulf between the way that we made it initially and the way that we typically make it now for mass production. Yeah, it was like looking. I meant looking at the book in a new way, and I meant looking at, I guess, modern society life in a new way as well, to an extent.
Yeah. I thought the section on acid-free paper was really interesting. So did does paper always have acid and the acid can cause papers to degrade. So if you want something to last, you get acid-free paper, but that implies that like regular paper has acid in it. Is that from like when they were making paper in China, thousands of years ago, did it have is there something about the
Hmm.
process that makes it acidic, or is it the more of the modern way that we make paper that makes it
Yeah,
acidic?
yeah. So the problem started when we started making paper out of wood, which is a relatively modern phenomenon. I think it's the last 2 centuries or so where we've used wood pulp, and it's, of course, there's lots of wood around. It's a plentiful raw material, but there is a substance in wood called lignin, which can cause paper to degrade. Just without doing anything else to it. But there's also a part of the paper making process called sizing, where the paper is treated with different chemicals to make it whiter, to make it more or less absorbent of ink, depending on the use for the paper. And for a while, the chemicals that were used for that sizing process were acidic. And again, they would leach into the paper, they'd cause it to degrade over time. But the third thing was also just the environment. So during the Industrial Revolution, we were burning huge quantities of coal and the air and gas, in fact, in people's homes for lighting and heating. And this meant that the air was relatively acidic. And this hastened the demise of lots of books made at the time. So there was a whole pile of
Hmm.
factors that led to this phenomenon of acid paper. And in fact, when I was researching the book, I was visiting the National Library of Scotland quite frequently, and you can really see these old, yellowed, brittle um, papers in books. They don't even have to be that old. Even now, if you buy a relatively cheap paperback, that it will go quite yellow. It may not be made with acid-free paper because it's not expected to last for more than a few years, or to be needed to last for more than a few years.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that some museums are trying to de-acidify their books.
This is an interesting thing, or an interesting process. So I think NASA got involved quite early. They were using one particular substance. I think it's called diethyl zinc, and it turns out to be quite unstable. If it mixes with water, it explodes. And there was an explosion. They were trying to immerse or fumigate books with this diethyl zinc, and someone incredibly opened a tap that allowed a whole pile of water to flood in, and there was an explosion. So it hasn't always. I don't think anyone was hurt. But I don't know the current state of it. I know that the Library of Congress in the States does not currently have a mass deacidification project ongoing, and I think their argument is that this is still being developed. As I wrote the book, I got the impression that no one is really sure what the best way is to do this, and it sounds like perhaps that's still the case.
Yeah. The book is filled with just interesting tidbits, little interesting facts. One and one relating to books holding up is the ink on the Book of Kells. So, in some ways, these older books have held up better than the current paper books, and the ink on the Book of Kells held up surprisingly well until it went to Australia on a plane, and you
Mm.
said the vibration from the plane caused some damage to the ink.
So I think I didn't actually dig it. It was a nice tidbit. I didn't dig deeply enough into the story, but my suspicion is the ink that was used at the time was often called iron gall ink. It was made from, I think it was iron sulfate and oak galls. So you get these little growths on oak trees where I think insects basically damage the wood of the tree, and the tree grows a little sort of nodule to repair itself or to protect itself. Often wasps, I think, lay eggs or otherwise attack the tree and cause these things to grow. And so scribes would harvest the oak galls and they'd soak them with iron sulfite and make the ink. This ink is incredibly permanent. It sort of leaches into the papyrus. It's not the papyrus, so the parchment fixes itself really firmly. But what the Book of Kells is famous for is all of the illustrations, and they were done more commonly with paint or with gesso or even things like egg whites and so on. So the paint is, I don't think, as stable or as robust as the ink is that was used for the words. And I think probably it was more likely to be the illustrations which were slightly damaged by the journey on the plane.
Yeah. Yeah. What are some of your favorite tidbits from the book?
Oh, that's a big question. That's a really big question. Um, I really enjoyed learning about how parchment is made, and as I explain it, that's going to sound really grim. That paints a bad picture of me. Um, so parchment, I imagine your listeners know, is made from animal skins, so sheep, goats, cows, and so on. And just the process by which you make a sheet of parchment is incredibly time consuming. First, you have to grow a sheep or a goat or a cow,
Right.
and ideally, you want to slaughter it before it's about a year old, because if you wait any longer, it starts to get marks in its skin. The skin gets too thick. So you slaughter a cow, you take the skin off it. You've got to then soak it in a whole pile of noxious baths with like sort of lime and so on until the hair starts to get loose. And then you scrape it off with a knife, and then you wash it again until it's clean. And then you string it up on this kind of frame. Um, and you've got to use that. You've got to scrape it very, very carefully until it's even, and then you leave it for quite a long time until it all dries, and that's a sheet of parchment. And finally, you can cut a very big rectangle out of this, and then make sheets of parchment for books. So I enjoyed learning about the process, but the thing I think that I found quite ironic at the end of it is that the reason, or not ironic, perhaps surprising, the reason that books are rectangular is broadly because sheep, cows, and goats are rectangular. When
Oh.
when 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 you take like a cow and you make a big sheet of parchment out of it, and you want to make it into something with right angles, you get a rectangle. And so if you cut that in half, you get two rectangles, and if you cut those in half, you get more rectangles. So the fact that books are rectangular is largely to do with maximizing the use of animal skin for parchment. It's also
Hmm.
partly to do with the fact that humans just like books about this size. Like, human anatomy means that books all tend to be roughly the same size. And rectangular books are also rectangular because the spine allows them to be a bit stronger. You don't want to have a very short spine and very long pages. But
Hmm.
the fact that cows, sheep, and goats are mostly rectangular is also one of the reasons why books are and continue to be rectangular.
Huh. Interesting. When did we go primarily from parchment to paper?
So in the West, we used parchment for quite a long time, kind of up to the into past, I think, sort of 1100 or 1200 CE. And we only really got paper because of the Spanish, because Spain was invaded by Moors from North Africa. This was a big deal in Europe at the time, and part of Spain was occupied by Moors for quite a long time, and they built paper mills. They brought knowledge of paper making from basically from the east, from China and so on, and it passed through, passed all the way from the east to the west via this invasion. And finally, when Spain was reconquered, these paper mills were still there, and the knowledge of paper making then spread out from there across the rest of Europe and, of course, into the rest of the world. Um, Although China was already making paper quite happily, so we were somewhat
Yeah.
behind.
Yeah, it was so interesting to me, like, just like emoji, paper was political. There was a point where, the Holy Roman Emperor was so suspicious of the Moors who brought paper that he said, what did you say? That any government document written on paper was invalid. Like,
Hmm,
wow, paper, even paper is
yeah.
political. But it was invented in China, and, I think people might be interested to know too, like, China also invented movable type. You think it was Gutenberg, but actually that also, was invented in China.
That was yeah. That was used to be when I started researching this. I was quite I think China is said to have four great inventions. It's gunpowder, the magnetic compass, paper, and printing. So printing had been around for quite a long time in China, and typically it was done by taking a large bit of wood, um, writing or drawing the thing you wanted to print, using a brush on some paper, turning it over, rubbing it onto the block of wood, and then carving out all of the white space, all of the negative space between the characters. And then you've got a block where you can print. You can print from. You can ink it. You can press another piece of paper onto it, and you get an impression from it. But there was a move to different times and for different reasons, different Chinese people tried to make this more efficient, and the concept of movable type was thus invented, or it came about in China, but it never seemed to quite work. I think there were difficulties with getting all of these individual characters level, of getting a decent impression out of it, but also Chinese script kind of militates against this as well. There's so many different Chinese characters. You need such a big basic vocabulary that it became impractical to have enough of these. They're called sorts, individual characters. It became impractical to have enough sorts to do proper movable type printing in China. And so one of the advantages that Gutenberg had when he finally decided to have a go at it was that the Latin alphabet is so much shorter. You've got lowercase, uppercase, a few marks of punctuation, maybe numbers, and you can print lots of things with that very restricted set of characters. So he had this sort of built-in advantage when he first took a look at it and tried to improve the technology.
Right, it's maybe a couple, it's not thousands and thousands of characters, and then yeah, and then Gutenberg, that was one of the revolutions in printing. You said that in the 50 years after the printing of the Gutenberg Bible, there were as many books printed as or produced as the 1,000 years before that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I didn't want to paint Gutenberg as being the inventor of printing. That would have been inaccurate.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard to say that it didn't have a massive impact. Um, Spelling, punctuation was standardized to quite a large extent just because you could print so many copies of a particular book. Whereas, if you're copying every single book, every single character by hand from one copy of a book to the next, you have mistakes creeping in, you've got personal preferences creeping in, you've got changes in fashion creeping in, and that does happen in printing as well. But um, I think it's hard to argue that printing didn't have a really big standardizing effect. And of course, you can print so many more of them, right? So many more books than you can copy by hand. We learn more. We are better at transmitting information. I think one of the things when I started at the very start of the book, when I started talking about writing, was this idea that in Egypt the myth was that writing was handed down by the god Thoth to the king of the Egyptians at the time, and he said, well, thanks, but won't we just start forgetting things? And there is this kind of moral panic every time there's a new information technology of some kind, that it will take away some essential part of our humanity. If you give us writing, won't we forget how to remember things? If you give us calculators, won't we forget how to do maths? If you give us printing, will we forget how to write things? Every time we come up with some new innovation like this, it freaks people out. But then the thing that I remind myself is that I'm allowed to have a terrible memory because writing exists. I can write something down and find it later. Of all the things, I think perhaps the most important thing about books is that they are this reservoir of knowledge. I can carry a book with me and I don't have to remember it. I can read it. I can open it to the index. I can find the thing that I'm looking for. That's what's sort of magical about them, and still really useful even today, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean and that is the book, your book, the book. We barely I mean, we've just skimmed the absolute top. This is a book with just so much information in it about the history of books and paper and printing and everything. I highly recommend it. Um, the book by Keith Houston. So, and now for books, because we love books so much, I want to hear your book recommendations.
Okay. The first one is, I suspect, very boring and very obvious, but it's Moby Dick. If anyone who is listening to this or watching this has not read Moby Dick, I urge you to read it. It's a movable feast. It lasts forever for one thing, but you don't want it to end. You inhabit the world of the Pequod. You're there with Ishmael. You're ranging through time and space. It's amazing. Um,
Wonderful. I will confess at the risk of being judged that by my listeners that I have not read Moby Dick. I've never read it, and I hear people talk about it. It is actually it's on my to read list already. I know I need to read it. I want to read it, so now I'm going to move it up.
It was um, a real eye opener for me. I don't think I can even explain why I like it so much, but I do, and it's just actually there's in Moby Dick there's one particular chapter where Melville is talking about different sizes of whales, and he uses paper sizes. So he talks about
Oh,
octavo whales. So octavo is a single big piece of paper which has been folded to give you 8 sheets. And he talks about duodecimal whales, which are when you get much smaller, you get 12 sheets of a piece of paper. So you get folio whales are the big ones, and then octavo whales and quarto whales and so on. So he uses paper sizes to talk about the size of whales. There you go. So there's a way in.
very cool. Okay.
The next one is a bit more obscure. It's called Excession. So it's Excession, and it's a science
Hmm.
fiction novel by a Scottish writer called Ian Banks. And he was born and grew up fairly close to where I did, and he died relatively recently. I think it's just about sort of 10 or 15 years ago. Too young, I think. Um, but he's written a huge amount of stuff. He mostly wrote kind of quite gritty mainstream fiction, but then later in his career he started to do science fiction stuff as well, and just the joy and the verve in it.
Hmm.
He devises this civilization called the culture, which is basically people, perhaps relevant now, people plus AIs, which he calls minds. And it's a kind of anarchic, quasi-socialist utopia, I suppose. Whether your readers find it interesting or not, I don't know. But just the writing and the feeling of joy. And it's a rollicking ride. It's very much a space opera type thing. It's great. For me, it was the way into reading much more of his work.
Oh, that sounds great. Yeah, my husband and I listen to sci-fi audiobooks a lot together, so that sounds like something we could add to our list, our
Ah,
joint
good stuff.
list. Yeah.
And the last one is called Shift Happens, and this is cheating a little bit because I think it's already out of print. It is a massive book. It's a book that
Hmm.
was written quite recently by a kind of an internet friend of mine called Martian Wihari. He works
Mhm.
for Figma, the design company or the design website company, and it is 3 volumes about the history of the keyboard. So,
Hmm.
where did the QWERTY keyboard come from? How did it evolve? Um, how did we end up with the smart, the soft keyboards on our smartphones and so on? And it's something you get lost in. He's a really fantastic writer, and it seems like such a niche subject, and it is. Let's not lie, but it's just a fascinating one to read about. You get into design, you get into sort of mechanical design and graphic design and language and human, a sort of human computer interaction. It's great. You almost certainly
Wonderful.
can't buy a copy, but you should if you can find one.
Oh, I wonder if maybe the ebook would be available?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I know that a lot of work went into making the physical edition. It has like a slipcase and everything. So I don't
Oh,
even know
wow.
if an ebook is available. But yeah,
Ooh.
acquire one by means fair or foul, I would suggest.
Wonderful. Well, Keith Houston, thank you so much. In this episode, we talked about the book called The Book. In the main episode, we talked about Face with Tears of Joy, his book all about emoji. He's also written The Empire of the Sum, which is about the calculators, and Shady Characters, which is about punctuation marks. So all fabulous books. Keith, where can people find you?
So my blog, shadycharacters.co.uk, is the best place. You can find me and all my books there, and also links to other places like social media and so on.
Wonderful. And thank you again, Keith. Thank you to the Grammar Pelusians for supporting the show. I'll see you next time.